We're thankful you're here, hopefully, and serve an amazing God. If you have your Bibles, let me encourage you to turn to Luke chapter 19. We're going to begin here and we'll end somewhere else as we think about the topic of welcoming the King. Luke chapter 19. As you're turning there, and maybe to kind of help set the stage and get our minds wrapped around our topic, I want us to think about how we would approach a situation if we were to come in contact with royalty. Now, in the United States, we don't necessarily have royalty like other countries do or different time periods have, but if you're in contact with people that are of authority or power, a king or queen, prince, princess, a president, a senator, a governor, somebody that's important because of their position, because of where they're at in society, and maybe because of their family lineage and where they live and the things that they possess, right? If you knew you're going to come in contact with one of those people, what would you change about yourself? Maybe brush your hair if you have any, or maybe you take a shower that morning, right? You might even go buy something brand new to wear. You might even try to practice what you might say, or think of some questions you might ask them so that the conversation isn't awkward, right? You would want to prepare to come into the presence of a king, or to come into the presence of royalty. As we come together to worship, we've come into the presence of the King. We've come into the presence of royalty. And I hope the time change didn't mess us up. I hope we've come prepared this morning. Not necessarily brushing our hair or taking a shower. All those things are important. I hope we've prepared our heart to come into the presence of a King and to be the type of people that are ready to serve Him and honor Him because of who He is and the position that He holds. You might have seen this picture. It's from 2013. Queen of England was visiting the nation of Fiji. And as she got there and was going from place to place, she had soldiers from the nation of Fiji lining the sidewalk that she was walking between. And as you notice, one of those soldiers has sat down on the ground to salute her. Now, in our culture, if somebody takes a knee during the national, respectful. But for here, this culture, this is a sign of respect. In the culture of Fiji, it's thought that all good things come from the head and then are passed down to the feet. And so if there's someone in the room that is of more importance than you or of nobility, it's important that their head is above yours. And so this soldier, being taller than the queen, saw it important to make her head higher than his. He sat down on the ground, and the queen was familiar with the culture and was deeply moved by this soldier's act of respect and honor towards her. Is that how we would welcome our king? In Luke chapter 19, we have a king coming into the midst of people. You might remember back a few Sundays ago on a Sunday night, we talked about God as our king, how He enthroned Himself for God's people. The Ten Commandments, the first several of those deal with God being king. And then there's a time in which Israel replaced Him. We want to be like other nations, and Saul was put on the throne. And then by the time we get to the New Testament, Jesus will be put on trial, and the crowds will say, "We have no king but Caesar." And God is forgotten as king. But you remember that the book of Revelation teaches that God is still on His throne. That regardless of whether you honor Him as king and respect Him as king, you can't remove Him from being king. Now, you can remove Him from being king of your life, and you can put other things of more importance in your life, but at the end of time, God is still king. You will still stand before Him on Judgment Day, whether you have honored Him as king or not. One of the passages that represent God and Christ as king, we didn't notice in that lesson, and it's here in Luke chapter 19. We begin in verse 28 as we think about the plans that are made for this event. And when He had said these things, He went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When He drew near to Bethphage and Bethany, and says, I tell you what, I really would like something to ride. Why don't you go? I tell you what, I really would like something to ride. Why don't you go find a donkey? It's not as if Jesus is unplanned. As He's going to come into Jerusalem for the final time, in a matter of a week, Jesus will be on a cross. As He comes into Jerusalem the final time, He's setting the stage for how people will treat Him. You go back to how Zechariah chapter 9 prophesied this moment. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he. This prophet, many years before the time of Jesus, says, your king is coming. How's he riding? What's he coming in? He's riding in, says, your king is coming. How's he riding? What's he coming in? He's riding in a chariot. He's riding with a white horse of Rome. He's riding with power. He's humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Your president is coming into town. He's not in Air Force One. He's not in his limousine. He's riding a unicycle, right? Really? That's not how royalty rides. That's not how they come into town. That's not here's your king coming riding on a donkey. Well, our king's not like other kings, is he? In the highest. And the Bible, the Gospels teach us that they take their coats and lay them on the ground. And they take palm leaves and lay them on the ground. So that as Jesus rides on this donkey, the donkey's feet don't even have to touch the ground. A sign of respect, a sign of honor, that this is our king. We see Jesus as being our king. Verse 38. We see Jesus as being royalty. You know, it's a miracle of the wisdom of Jesus to know where this animal is, the question that's going to be asked when his apostles untie it. But it's another miracle that Jesus is able to ride this donkey, because Luke gives us the insight. No one's ever rode him before. And some of you are familiar with breaking and riding horses or donkeys or teams of mules, right? And you know the work that goes into that. That's why we call it breaking an animal, because they have a strong stubbornness, a strong will, and I have to teach them it's not what you want to do, but it's what I want you to do. I'm going to be able to ride you or lead you or direct you as to where you're going to go and how you're going to work. This animal had never been through that before. Barn, and they've got horses that are worth so much money in there, and there's always music, sometimes rock music, playing in the barn. Why? We have to get these animals used to hearing noise. If they hear a quiet barn their whole life and then are taken in the middle of a show ring where there are people are talking and music is playing, this animal acts differently. Here you have a donkey in the midst of chaos, yet Jesus is riding it. Jesus is the master overall. He walked on the water and calmed the storm, and even the animal kingdom is part of Jesus' control. But maybe the most important part we notice is the praise that's given to him. You notice in 2 Kings chapter 9, that this is something that was given to kings, this type of praise, that as Jehu was anointed king and he's coming out, he's walking down, they made haste, every one of them, to take their garment and put it on the bare steps and blew the trumpet and proclaimed him as king. Many years before the time of Jesus, this was seen as a symbol of royalty's coming. We don't want him to walk on the ground. We're going to take our own coats off and let them get dirty so that this man's sandals don't have to touch the steps. He's our king. We're praising him as such. And you notice that some people have problems with that. As people are praising him and saying, blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord, verse 39, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said, teacher, rebuke your disciples. Hey, don't you hear what they're saying about you? You're not Pilate. You're not the emperor. You're not God. That's what the Pharisees thought. They had problems with Jesus thinking that. Tell your disciples to be quiet. To which Jesus replies in verse 40, I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. I love that phrase, the very stones would cry out. It might mean that Jesus is talking about the rocks on the ground, nature, and say, even if these people don't praise me, nature praises me. Might be saying that. Jesus is standing in Jerusalem coming into the temple built out of very large stones or rocks. It might be saying that, hey, even these stones of this temple sing praises to me. There's another option, though, and I don't know exactly what Jesus meant here, but right outside the city of Jerusalem is this massively large cemetery. Now, it wasn't quite this big when Jesus was there. It's been added to since then. But a cemetery has been right outside the walls of Jerusalem there since the days of Solomon. People have been buried in this area. You might could imagine, as Jesus said, if these that are living stop praising me, the stones, the tombstones of the dead will praise me. Doesn't matter who is quiet because the other will be loud. These very stones will cry out because our King is worthy of praise. I think and I love about Luke chapter 19, it teaches us about royalty coming in our presence. Is that how we would act when Jesus is our King? We love on Sunday morning to see songs about that He's my King. I walk with the King, right? We sing songs about Jesus being our King, but you're in Luke chapter 19, aren't you? Flip over 3 chapters later to Luke chapter 23. Because in Luke chapter 23, it's the same Jesus, it's the same crowd, but it's a different. They're not saying, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, but now they're saying something different. Jesus isn't king anymore. What's Jesus? He's a criminal. Notice, picking up in verse 20, Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I found no guilt in him deserving of death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, and he delivered Jesus over to their will. The same Jesus, the same crowd that's gathered here for this week-long festival of Passover, standing in front of the same place here in Jerusalem. And before we say Jesus is our King, and now we say Jesus is a criminal, crucify him. Will we honor Jesus as King and change our minds a week later? That would never happen to me. Could never happen to me, right? I'm here Sunday morning. I'm singing our songs. I'm following in my Bible. Jesus is King. I'm not going to change my mind a week later. They did. And they were right there beside him. Jesus, I trust him. My hope is built on nothing less until I walk into a ballot bowl Tuesday and, well, boy, my hope's built on something else then. Jesus, my only hope is in you. But Tuesday night, I sure am going to be anxious about who wins that election. Do we honor Jesus as King today and change our mind Tuesday? I hope not. I hope our faith is deeper than that. I hope our hope is deeper than that. I hope our relationship with God is deeper than that. Do we honor Jesus as King on Sunday and then act like we don't know him at school on Monday? Act like we don't know him at practice on Friday? Act like we've never heard of him at work? Act like we... Is Jesus our King and we change our mind? Maybe we wouldn't shout, "Crucify him." But every time that I lack the commitment and I lack the faith and I lack the trust in God, can he still feel the nails every time I fail? Does he hear the crowd shout, "Crucify again"? I may not be verbally shouting, "Crucify him," but by my heart and my faith in my life, I might be. How can I withstand the storm? How can I make sure that what happened to these folks in the book of Luke doesn't happen to me? Let me give you a couple pointers as you think about that. If you will, turn over to the book of Galatians. The book of Galatians is about a group of Christians who have honored Christ and become a part of God's church. And Paul's writing to them because they're kind of ready to give up on that. And chapter 1 says they're turning to a different gospel. They're turning to a different good news. Part of which is they're going back to the old laws of Judaism. They're starting to think about things like circumcision again as being a matter of salvation. And they're really thinking about lineage with Abraham. And they're thinking about the works of the law. And so the book of Galatians is like, hey, let's stay committed to God. Let's not just honor him at one part and then fall away, but let's stay faithful. And so how can we do that? How can I make sure that I build a relationship with God that will last? And the beginning part of that is I've got to develop a commitment to God. I've got to develop a commitment to God. Not just this casual acquaintance with him, but a commitment to him. You know, there are people in your life you're committed to. If you were to get a phone call right now that some of these people are stuck on the side of the road or in the hospital, you would get up and go help them, wouldn't you? Because you're committed to them. A parent, a child, a spouse. But then there's some other folks that we're not that committed to. And it's not that we don't love them. It's just that, well, I'm not that close to them. They've got other people that can help. I'll help them, but I've got some things I've got to do first, right? We understand commitment and that relationships are like that. Jesus had those folks that were desperately committed to him. And he had folks that weren't too. You think about these people here in the book of Luke, or really the entire life of Jesus. You've got people that heard him teach, that saw him perform miracles, that were there when he raised the dead, when he fed the 5,000, that walked on the water. They followed him. They followed him from place to place. But when the going got tough, they weren't there anymore. They had an acquaintance with Jesus, but never were really committed to him. In the Bible reading that Doug read this morning, the passage, the last part of that, all the disciples forsook him and fled. We'll follow Jesus up to a point, but then my commitment's not going to be there the rest of the way, right? What type of relationship do we have? You notice Galatians chapter 4, beginning in verse 4, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those that are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent this." God could have left us stranded on the side of the road, but he saw the importance of being committed to his creatures, to his creation, to his children. And you see the change that happens in verses 4 through 7. I'm no longer a slave, but now called a son. And when I'm a son, I call my God Father. What a beautiful relationship to have with the King. He's not some distant man that sits on the throne. He's my Father. I can talk to him about anything that I want. Is that the commitment that you have? Or do we follow Jesus? Is that the commitment that you have? Or do we follow Jesus when he's feeding us with the 5,000 others? Do we follow Jesus when he's performing miracles, making us feel better? Do we follow Jesus when he's on a cross and I'm on the one beside him? What type of commitment do we have? We think about that change from slavery to sonship. Abraham Lincoln in January of 1863 signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the Confederacy. That was signed. It went into law. And you and I, when laws are written because of news and media and the internet and radio and television, we know about laws going into effect within hours of them happening, don't we? But in 1863, that's not the case. There are people that continue to live are free. Are we sharing that so people know about it? Or are we letting people continue to live in slavery because they don't know there's a better way? I don't know who put it together, somebody a lot smarter than me. But here's how they arranged Galatians 6, 1 through 10. And I love the way it's portrayed here. If I'm going to be a part of God's people and develop a relationship with the church, I've got to reach out, reach in, reach deep, and reach around. I've got to begin by reaching out to those they're falling away from Christ. Brothers, if anyone is called into transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself too, lest you be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. When those that are struggling around me, and they're failing to be faithful to